The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cottonwood Springs, a small but growing cattle town nestled in the eastern foothills of the Wyoming Territory. Samuel Blackwood stood on the porch of his general store, his weathered hands gripping the wooden railing as he surveyed the town he'd helped build over the past 15 years. At 46, Samuel's once dark hair had streaks of silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes told stories of harsh winters, summer droughts, and the constant vigilance required to carve a life out of this unforgiving land. He had come west after the war, carrying little more than painful memories and a determination to build something lasting, far from the battlefields that still haunted his dreams. The store bell jingled behind him as Thomas Miller, his young clerk, stepped out. "Mr. Blackwood, I finished the inventory like you asked. We're running low on coffee and sugar, and Mrs. Peterson's order of fabric came in." Thomas was eager to please, reminiscent of Samuel himself at that age, before life had hardened him. Samuel nodded, his eyes still fixed on the horizon, where a stagecoach was approaching, trailing dust in its wake. There was something about this particular arrival that made him uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. "I'd kindly like to ask you to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this story so far. I'm curious, what city are you watching from?" Samuel had built his life in Cottonwood Springs with careful precision. After arriving as a broken man, a former Union Army captain with nightmares that woke him shouting, he had methodically created a place for himself in this community. Starting as a clerk in the very store he now owned, he had worked his way up, saved every penny, and eventually bought the business when old Mr. Jenkins decided to return east. The townsfolk respected Samuel for his fair dealings, his quiet competence, and the stability he represented. He extended credit during hard times and donated supplies when families faced tragedy. The town council sought his advice on matters of importance, and young men came to him for stern but fair guidance. "Will you be needing anything else, Mr. Blackwood?" Thomas asked, fidgeting with his apron. Samuel shook his head, dismissing the boy with a wave of his hand. As Thomas retreated into the store, Samuel's attention remained fixed on the approaching stagecoach. It wasn't the regular weekly stage from Cheyenne. That had arrived yesterday. This was an unscheduled arrival, and in Samuel's experience, unexpected things rarely brought good fortune in the West. He straightened his vest and ran a hand through his hair, a habit from his younger days when he'd cared more about appearances. Now, his practical clothes, sturdy trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a simple black vest spoke to his preference for functionality over fashion. The stagecoach rumbled to a stop in front of the town's only hotel, the Cottonwood Inn, kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured Samuel's view. When it cleared, his breath caught in his throat. Descending from the coach was a woman unlike any he'd seen in Cottonwood Springs before. Even from a distance, she commanded attention. Tall and straight-backed, with rich auburn hair pinned beneath a stylish hat. Her traveling dress, though dusty from the journey, was clearly of fine quality, its deep green fabric catching the last rays of sunlight. She moved with a confidence that suggested she was accustomed to being noticed. Yet, there was nothing affected about her bearing. Samuel found himself unable to look away as she directed the driver regarding her trunks. Sheriff John Dawson approached the stage, offering assistance as was his custom with new arrivals. Samuel watched their interaction, noting how the woman smiled and extended her hand to the lawman in a forthright manner that spoke of Eastern upbringing and education. Samuel knew he should return to his work, The store's books needed balancing, and a shipment needed preparation for the outlying ranches. Yet he remained rooted to his spot, watching as the sheriff escorted the newcomer into the hotel. Only after she had disappeared from view did Samuel exhale slowly, unaware he'd been holding his breath. "Fool," he muttered to himself, turning to re-enter his store. "She's nothing to do with you." That evening, Samuel sat alone at his usual table in the corner of Maggie's cafe, methodically cutting into the steak before him while reviewing mental lists of tasks for the coming week. The cafe was busier than usual for a Tuesday, the buzz of conversation punctuated by the clink of cutlery and the occasional burst of laughter. Maggie Wilson, a widow who had opened the establishment 5 years prior, stopped by his table with a pot of coffee. "Heard about our new arrival?" she asked, refilling his cup without waiting for an answer. Before Samuel could respond, the cafe door opened and a hush fell over the room as the woman from the stagecoach entered. In the lamplight, her features were more distinct: high cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes the color of whiskey. "That's her now," Maggie whispered. "Unnecessarily. Miss Elizabeth Hargrove, from Boston. Apparently, she's here to start a school." This information surprised Samuel. Cottonwood Springs had been discussing the need for a proper school for years, but no one had expected a solution to arrive unannounced on an irregular stage from Cheyenne. He watched as Miss Hargrove was greeted by Mayor Phillips and his wife, who had evidently been waiting for her. The mayor's booming voice carried across the room as he made introductions to other prominent citizens. Samuel lowered his eyes to his plate, hoping to avoid being included in this social ritual. He had built his life around simple, predictable patterns, and this woman, with her city ways and educated manner, represented a complication he didn't need. Samuel's hopes were dashed when Mayor Phillips approached his table, Miss Hargrove in tow. "Samuel, my boy, I want you to meet our new schoolteacher. Miss Hargrove, this is Samuel Blackwood, owner of our general store and a founding member of our town council." Samuel stood awkwardly, wiping his hands on his napkin before extending one to the woman. "Miss Hargrove," he said simply, meeting her gaze directly. Her handshake was firm and confident, her skin soft against his calloused palm. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice rich and clear, with the refined accent of the educated East. "I understand you're something of an institution in Cottonwood Springs. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on what the children here need most from their education." The directness of her approach caught Samuel off guard. Women in Cottonwood Springs, the wives of ranchers and merchants, the few unmarried ladies who worked as seamstresses or in the hotel, rarely addressed him with such straightforward academic interest. "I'm just a storekeeper, Miss Hargrove," he replied cautiously. "The families hereabouts have their own ideas about schooling." Something flashed in her eyes, amusement perhaps, or challenge. "Indeed, Mr. Blackwood, and I intend to hear all those ideas. But Mayor Phillips tells me you stock the only books in town and order special titles when requested. That suggests a man with an appreciation for learning." Before Samuel could formulate a response, Mayor Phillips had steered Miss Hargrove to another table, leaving Samuel standing, strangely unsettled by the brief exchange. As dawn broke the next morning, Samuel was already at work in the small office behind his store. Rising early was a habit formed during the war and reinforced by the demands of commerce in a frontier town. The ledgers before him showed a healthy business, not wealthy by Eastern standards, but secure in a way few enterprises were in the still Wild West. A knock at the back door interrupted his calculations. When he opened it, he found Miss Hargrove standing there, dressed more practically than the previous evening, in a simple blue skirt and white shirtwaist, though still more elegantly than most women in town would wear for morning errands. "Miss Hargrove," he said, surprise evident in his voice, "the store doesn't open for another hour." She smiled, the expression warming her features and bringing a sparkle to those unusual amber eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood. I apologize for the early intrusion, but I was hoping to speak with you privately about supplies for the school." There was something disarming about her directness that made Samuel step aside and gesture for her to enter. "I've prepared a list," she continued, pulling a folded paper from a small leather satchel. "The town council has approved a modest budget, but I wanted your advice on what might be reasonably obtained here versus what must be ordered from back east." Samuel accepted the list, scanning it with a merchant's practiced eye. Slates, chalk, primers, maps, a globe. Standard items for a schoolroom, though some would indeed need special ordering. "Most of this will need to come from Chicago or St. Louis," Samuel said, moving to his desk and motioning for her to take the chair opposite. "I can have the basic supplies within 2 weeks, but the specialized items, the maps and globe particularly, might take a month or more." He expected disappointment at this news, but Miss Hargrove merely nodded, practical in her acceptance of frontier limitations. "That's what I anticipated. In the meantime, I'd like to see what books you currently stock that might serve as temporary readers for different ages. Mayor Phillips mentioned you have a personal library as well." The question bordered on presumptuous. A personal library was just that, personal. But her expression showed only professional interest, not intrusion. Samuel hesitated, protective of the private world he'd built. His collection of books, gathered over years and at considerable expense, was one of the few indulgences he permitted himself. They were companions on long winter evenings, connections to a wider world beyond the frontier, and reminders of the education he'd received before war and westward migration had reshaped his life. "I do have some volumes that might be suitable," he admitted finally. "You're welcome to review what's available in the store. My personal collection is blank. Eclectic, but you could view it if you find the store selection insufficient." This offer, made almost against his better judgment, was met with a warm smile that transformed Miss Hargrove's face from merely handsome to genuinely beautiful. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I appreciate your generosity." She rose from the chair with fluid grace. "I understand the school building itself requires some repair before it's suitable for classes. I was hoping to inspect it today, but Mayor Phillips is occupied with other matters. Might you have time to show me the property?" The request was reasonable, yet Samuel felt a flicker of alarm. He had carefully constructed his life to maintain a certain distance from others, cordial in business, respected in the community, but ultimately separate and self-contained. Something about Elizabeth Hargrove threatened that careful arrangement, and the prospect of spending more time in her company was both appealing and disconcerting. "I have inventory to complete this morning," he began, then stopped at the flash of disappointment in her eyes. "But I could meet you there at noon, if that would suit." True to his word, Samuel arrived at the abandoned carpenter shop that had been designated as Cottonwood Springs' first proper schoolhouse, precisely at noon. The building, located at the edge of town, had been empty since old Mr. Henderson had passed away the previous winter. It was sturdy enough, but would need considerable work to transform it into a suitable learning environment. Miss Hargrove was already there, examining the large windows with a critical eye. She had tied her auburn hair back with a simple ribbon, and a smudge of dust marked one cheek, evidence that she had been investigating the property thoroughly. "The light is excellent," she remarked as he approached. That's crucial for a schoolroom. The main concern is the roof. There's a leak in the northeast corner that will need repair before the rainy season. Samuel nodded, impressed by her practical assessment. Many Eastern transplants arrived with unrealistic expectations, but Elizabeth Hargrove seemed to understand the realities of frontier life. Henderson was getting on in years. Maintenance suffered in his final months, Samuel explained, moving to examine the problematic corner. It shouldn't be difficult to fix. Tom Wilson, Maggie's son from the cafe, is handy with carpentry. I can speak to him about making repairs. Elizabeth gave him a considering look. You seem to know everyone in town and how to solve every problem, Mr. Blackwood. There was no mockery in her tone, only a thoughtful observation. Samuel shrugged, uncomfortable with the perception of himself as a problem solver. Small towns work through connections. When you've been somewhere 15 years, you learn who's good at what. They spent the next hour moving through the building, discussing necessary changes and improvements. Despite his initial reluctance, Samuel found himself engaged in the planning process, offering suggestions about shelving, desk arrangements, and the most efficient way to heat the space in winter. Elizabeth listened attentively, her questions revealing both intelligence and practical experience. "Have you taught before?" he asked finally, curious about what had brought this clearly capable woman to their remote corner of Wyoming. Something flickered across her face, a shadow of memory perhaps, before she nodded. "Yes, in Boston and briefly in Chicago, but I wanted—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I wanted a place where I could build something from the beginning, where education might make a real difference." There was more to her story, Samuel was certain, but he respected her privacy as he hoped she would respect his. They emerged from the building into the bright afternoon sunshine, having compiled a comprehensive list of needed repairs and supplies. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Blackwood," Elizabeth said, extending her hand in that forthright manner he was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "Your insights have been invaluable." As their hands met, Samuel felt again the strange disquiet that had marked their initial meeting. A sense that this woman, with her direct gaze and purposeful manner, represented a disruption to the careful order of his existence. "You're welcome, Miss Hargrove," he replied formally, withdrawing his hand perhaps more quickly than courtesy dictated. "If you need anything else, you can find me at the store." Over the next 2 weeks, Samuel found himself involved in the school project, despite his best intentions to maintain his customary distance. Elizabeth Hargrove proved to be a force of nature, marshaling the town's resources with diplomatic but unwavering determination. She had secured promises of labor from several fathers, donations of lumber from the sawmill, and even convinced the Ladies' Aid Society to sew curtains for the windows. Samuel watched her progress with a mixture of admiration and unease, aware that the community was rallying around her in a way that was transforming Cottonwood Springs. Children who had previously run wild through town during the day now followed Miss Elizabeth in an eager pack, helping to clean the schoolhouse and listening raptly as she described the wonders of learning that awaited them. One evening, as Samuel was closing the store, Elizabeth appeared with a small contingent of helpers, 3 boys around 12 years old, sons of local ranchers and merchants. "Mr. Blackwood," she called, her face alight with purpose, "we've come to collect those readers you mentioned might be suitable for the older students." Samuel had been expecting her, had in fact set aside several volumes that he thought appropriate, but the sight of her still caused that peculiar tightening in his chest. She wore a simple brown skirt and cream-colored blouse, her hair escaping its pins after a day of physical labor at the schoolhouse. A streak of whitewash marked her sleeve, and her hands showed signs of work that would have been beneath a Boston lady's dignity. "Come in," he said, holding the door as the boys filed past, suddenly on their best behavior under his stern gaze. Samuel had a reputation for fairness, but little patience with the rowdiness that often characterized the town's youth. He led them to a table where he had arranged a selection of books: Basic Readers, a simplified history of the United States, a volume of natural science appropriate for young minds, and several classics of literature. "These are what I have in stock that might serve your purposes," he explained, watching as Elizabeth examined each book with careful attention. The boys stood awkwardly nearby, nudging each other and stealing glances at the candy jars on the counter until Elizabeth assigned them each a book to examine. "These will do nicely to start," Elizabeth said, after reviewing the collection. "Though I'll need more as we progress. I've drafted a letter to my former colleagues in Boston, requesting donations from their personal libraries." She looked up at Samuel with a smile that transformed her face, creating a momentary connection that felt both intimate and unsettling. "You mentioned your own collection might have suitable volumes." The question hung in the air, an invitation that went beyond books. Samuel hesitated, protective of his private sanctuary. The small cabin behind the store where he lived was his retreat from the world, the one place where he allowed himself to exist without the careful facade he maintained in public. "Some of my books might be appropriate," he conceded finally. "I'll review them and bring any suitable ones to the school." It was a compromise, maintaining the boundary between his private life and the public project that Elizabeth represented. Something like disappointment flickered in her eyes, but she nodded acceptance of his terms. "That would be most helpful, Mr. Blackwood. We'll take these for now." As she gathered the selected volumes, her hand brushed against his, sending an unexpected jolt through Samuel's carefully controlled composure. He stepped back, creating distance, and busied himself with recording the transaction in his ledger. The boys, loaded with their literary burden, scuffed their feet impatiently by the door. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth paused. "The school dedication is this Sunday after church. I hope you'll attend, Mr. Blackwood. Your contributions have been significant, even if you've tried to keep them quiet." Her perceptiveness was disconcerting. Samuel had indeed provided materials at cost and arranged for repairs without seeking recognition. He nodded non-committally, uncomfortable with her acknowledgement of his involvement. After they had gone, Samuel stood in the empty store, aware of a strange hollowness that had nothing to do with the building's silence. He had spent years cultivating a life of order and purpose, free from the complications of close personal attachments. Now, in just 2 weeks, Elizabeth Hargrove had somehow breached his carefully constructed defenses, leaving him uncertain and off balance. Sunday arrived with the clear, crisp air of early autumn. Samuel dressed with slightly more care than usual, selecting a newer shirt and his good coat, the one reserved for funerals and the occasional wedding. He told himself it was merely respect for a community occasion, not a concession to Elizabeth Hargrove's unsettling presence in his thoughts. The church service was well attended, the small building filled with families dressed in their Sunday best. Samuel sat in his usual pew near the back, observing as Elizabeth entered with Mrs. Phillips, the mayor's wife. Even in the modest setting of Cottonwood Springs' simple church, she carried herself with a natural dignity that drew eyes. Her dress was appropriate but distinctive, deep blue that complemented her auburn hair, which was arranged more elaborately than on workdays. After the service, the congregation processed to the newly renovated schoolhouse. Samuel maintained his position at the edges of the crowd, uncomfortable with the festive atmosphere, yet unable to absent himself entirely. Mayor Phillips delivered a pompous speech about progress and the future of Cottonwood Springs, followed by Reverend Thomas, offering a blessing for the educational endeavor. Finally, Elizabeth stepped forward to address the gathering. Her voice, clear and confident, carried across the assembled townspeople. "Education is not merely about books and figures," she stated, her gaze sweeping across the crowd and momentarily connecting with Samuel's. "It's about preparing our children for a world that's changing rapidly. The frontier is being tamed, and those who will thrive in the coming years will need knowledge as well as practical skills." The speech was brief but effective, emphasizing the partnership between traditional frontier values and the education she offered. Samuel found himself admiring her diplomatic approach. She was neither condescending toward the town's current state nor apologetic about the changes she represented. As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to enjoy the potluck meal that had been arranged on tables outside, Samuel considered making a discreet departure. Before he could implement this plan, however, Elizabeth approached him, a plate of food in her hand. "You were planning to escape, weren't you, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her tone lightly teasing, but her eyes observant. Samuel felt exposed, as though she could read his intentions with uncomfortable accuracy. "I've attended the dedication, as requested," he replied, more stiffly than he intended. "I have work waiting at the store." Elizabeth tilted her head slightly, studying him with those perceptive amber eyes. "Always work, Mr. Blackwood? No time for celebration or community?" The question, though gently posed, struck uncomfortably close to the truth. Samuel had built his life around work and duty, deliberately avoiding the messy entanglements of deeper social connections. "The store doesn't run itself," he answered, aware of how defensive he sounded. Elizabeth's expression softened. "No, I imagine it doesn't. But perhaps you could spare another hour. I'd value your opinion on the final arrangement of the classroom. Most of these good people see only a tidy room with desks. You, I think, understand what makes a functional learning environment." The compliment was unexpected and disarming. Samuel found himself agreeing before he had fully considered the implications of extending his time in Elizabeth's company. They moved away from the crowd, entering the schoolhouse together. The transformation of the space was impressive. The formerly dusty carpenter's shop now featured neat rows of desks, a larger teacher's desk on a small platform, bookshelves along one wall, and large slate boards mounted where they could be easily seen. Curtains softened the windows, and a fresh coat of whitewash brightened the entire room. "You've accomplished a great deal in a short time," Samuel acknowledged, genuinely impressed by the efficiency with which Elizabeth had mobilized the community. Elizabeth moved through the room, touching a desk here, adjusting a curtain there, her pride in the creation evident. "It's still missing much that I'd consider essential, but it's a beginning." She turned to face Samuel, her expression earnest. "That's why your books would be so valuable, Mr. Blackwood. The children here have had limited exposure to ideas beyond their immediate experience. Your collection could open worlds for them." It was a reasonable request, yet Samuel felt that same instinctive resistance to sharing the private sanctuary of his personal library. Elizabeth must have sensed his reluctance, for she added softly, "I wouldn't ask if it weren't important." Knowledge changes lives. I believe you know that better than most in this town. There was something in her tone, an understanding that went beyond their brief acquaintance, that made Samuel look at her more closely. "You've been asking about me," he stated, not a question, but a realization. Elizabeth did not dissemble or apologize. "Yes," she admitted frankly, "I make it my business to understand the community where I work." "You're something of an enigma, Mr. Blackwood, a former Union officer with an education that suggests opportunities far beyond a frontier general store. Yet you've chosen this life, deliberately kept to yourself, and built walls around your private world." The assessment was uncomfortably accurate, leaving Samuel feeling exposed in a way he had carefully avoided for years. "My past is my own concern, Miss Hargrove," he said stiffly, "as is yours." The referent children attended during the day, while evening classes for adults, particularly those seeking to improve their English or basic arithmetic, filled the building 3 nights a week. Samuel observed these developments with mixed feelings. The positive impact on the town was undeniable. Children were more focused. Adults engaged in meaningful discussion rather than merely passing time at the saloon. And there was a sense of collective purpose that had previously been lacking. Yet the changes also represented a shift from the frontier self-sufficiency that had defined the community when Samuel first arrived. More troubling on a personal level was his own growing preoccupation with Elizabeth Hargrove. Despite his best efforts to maintain his customary distance, Samuel found himself involved in the school's progress. He ordered additional supplies without being asked, noticing needs before they became urgent. He repaired a broken window after hours, replaced a wobbly desk leg, and installed better lamps for the evening sessions. These actions, performed quietly and without seeking acknowledgement, did not go unnoticed by Elizabeth. She thanked him with a directness that made evasion impossible, her gratitude sincere but never effusive in a way that would have made him more uncomfortable. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the formality between them softened. Mr. Blackwood became Samuel in their private conversations, though she maintained proper address in public. One evening in mid-November, as the first serious snow of the season fell outside, Samuel was working late in his store when a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Elizabeth standing there, snowflakes melting in her hair and on the shoulders of her heavy coat. "Elizabeth," he said, surprised by her visit at this hour, "is something wrong at the school?" She shook her head, stepping inside as he moved back from the doorway. "No, nothing's wrong. I was passing and saw your light. She paused, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "I wanted to thank you for the books you sent over yesterday. The volumes on natural history are exactly what I needed for the older students." The thanks could have waited until morning, and they both knew it. Samuel closed the door against the cold, acutely aware of Elizabeth's presence in the otherwise empty store. She removed her gloves, rubbing her hands together for warmth. The domesticity of the gesture struck Samuel with unexpected force. "You should have waited for morning," he said, his tone gruffer than intended. "The weather's turning bad." Elizabeth smiled, the expression warming her features in the lamplight. "I've become quite accustomed to Western weather, Samuel. Boston winters prepared me well for cold, if not for the vastness of the snow here." There was something different about her tonight, a subtle shift in her usual composed demeanor, a hint of vulnerability that made Samuel's carefully maintained reserve waver. "I've been meaning to ask you," she continued, moving closer to the warmth of the store's pot-bellied stove, "about your service during the war. Mayor Phillips mentioned you were a captain?" The question was precisely the kind Samuel had spent years deflecting. Yet from Elizabeth, it seemed less an intrusion and more a natural extension of the cautious trust developing between them. He stoked the stove, buying time before answering. "Yes, with the 20th Maine. We saw action at Gettysburg and elsewhere. It was the bare minimum of information, facts available to anyone who might inquire, revealing nothing of the deeper experiences that had shaped him." Elizabeth watched him with those perceptive eyes, seeming to understand both what he said and what he withheld. "My brother served with the 2nd Massachusetts," she said quietly. "He didn't return." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words, a shared understanding of loss, of the war's long shadow that stretched across the nation, following even those who had sought new beginnings in the West. Samuel nodded, acknowledging her disclosure without pressing for details she might not wish to share. "Many didn't," he replied, the inadequacy of the response evident even to himself. Elizabeth moved closer, close enough that he could detect the faint lavender scent that always seemed to accompany her. "Is that why you came west, Samuel? To leave the war behind?" The question was gentle but direct, characteristic of her approach to all things. Samuel had spent years avoiding such conversations, deflecting personal inquiries with the practiced skill of a man determined to keep his past separate from his present. Yet something about this moment, the snow falling silently outside, the warm lamplight within, Elizabeth's presence, both challenging and comforting, made his usual defenses seem unnecessary, even unwanted. "Partly," he admitted, the word opening a door he had kept firmly closed. "I saw things, did things. The man I was before the war couldn't survive what came after. The West offered a chance to build something new, something simple and straightforward." He looked at her directly, allowing her to see something of the truth he usually kept hidden. "I wanted a life without complications, Elizabeth, a life I could control." Understanding dawned in her expression, a recognition that went beyond sympathy to something deeper, empathy born of similar experience. "And I complicated that," she said softly. The statement neither apologetic nor proud, simply acknowledging a truth they both recognized. Samuel could have denied it, maintained the fiction that her arrival had not disrupted the careful patterns of his existence. But dishonesty seemed impossible in this moment of unexpected intimacy. "Yes," he acknowledged, his voice low, "from the moment you stepped off that stage." The admission hung between them, charged with implications neither had openly addressed until now. Elizabeth did not retreat from the truth, but met his gaze steadily, her own walls lowered in response to his honesty. "I came west for similar reasons, Samuel," she said after a moment, "though perhaps from a different direction. Boston society has rigid expectations for women of my background. When I chose teaching over marriage to a suitable gentleman, it was considered eccentric but acceptable. When I continued that choice past the age where spinsterhood becomes a scandal rather than a quirk, the pressure became difficult to bear." Her lips curved in a wry smile. "My father had business interests in Chicago, so I relocated there, thinking a newer city might offer more freedom. And it did, in some ways, but—" She hesitated, and Samuel sensed they were approaching the heart of what had driven her to the far edges of civilization, to a small town in Wyoming Territory that had barely existed when he first arrived 15 years ago. "But," he prompted gently, offering her the same space for truth he had just claimed for himself. Elizabeth's gaze dropped momentarily. her fingers tracing patterns on the smooth wood of the counter between them. There was a man, a colleague at the school where I taught. He was married, though unhappily so. Nothing improper occurred, but there were feelings that became known. The scandal was sufficient to make my position untenable. She looked up, her expression defiant yet vulnerable. I did nothing wrong, Samuel. Yet I was the one who had to leave. I decided if I must start again, it would be somewhere I could build something entirely my own, without the constraints of established society or the shadows of past mistakes. The revelation explained much about her, the determination to create something meaningful in Cottonwood Springs, her comfort with standing apart from conventional expectations, the reserve that complemented her otherwise open manner. Samuel found himself moved by her trust in sharing this part of her history. "We all seek redemption in our own ways," he said quietly, the words offering neither judgment nor absolution, simply recognition of a shared human condition. For a moment, they stood in silence, the snow falling steadily outside the windows, creating a cocoon of isolation around the warm store. The distance Samuel had maintained for so long, from Elizabeth, from the community, perhaps even from himself, seemed suddenly an artificial construct, a barrier erected out of fear rather than necessity. Elizabeth moved first, breaking the spell of the moment with a small practical gesture, reaching for her gloves. "I should return to my lodgings before the snow deepens," she said, though her tone suggested reluctance to end their conversation. Samuel nodded, suddenly unwilling to see her go, yet uncertain how to ask her to stay. As she buttoned her coat, she looked up at him with a smile that transformed her face from merely handsome to genuinely beautiful. "Thank you, Samuel, for the books and for the truth. Both are precious gifts." The simple sincerity of her words touched something long dormant in Samuel, a capacity for connection he had deliberately suppressed in his quest for a controlled, uncomplicated existence. "Let me walk you to the hotel," he said, reaching for his own coat. It was a small gesture, commonplace in normal society. Yet for Samuel, it represented a significant departure from the careful isolation he had maintained. Elizabeth's smile deepened, her eyes warm with understanding of what the offer truly meant. "I would appreciate that," she replied simply. As they stepped out into the snowy night together, Samuel realized that the orderly life he had constructed was already irrevocably changed. The fierce beauty who had arrived on that stagecoach 3 months ago had indeed burned away his careful rules, leaving him standing on the threshold of a future he had never anticipated, one that seemed both frightening and filled with possibilities he had long denied himself. They walked slowly through the falling snow, their footprints marking a shared path across the pristine whiteness. Cottonwood Springs was quiet, most of its inhabitants already settled in for the evening. The hotel's windows glowed warmly ahead, yet Samuel found himself reluctant to reach their destination. "The Christmas pageant the children are preparing," he said, seeking a reason to prolong their time together. "I could help construct the backdrop you mentioned needing." Elizabeth glanced at him, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes. "That would be wonderful, Samuel. The children would be delighted." She paused, then added with gentle humor, "And their teacher would be grateful as well." When they reached the hotel porch, they turned to face each other. The moment held a weight of possibility, of paths diverging from the safe and familiar routes they had both chosen. "Good night, Samuel," Elizabeth said softly. "Thank you for the escort." Instead of immediately turning to go inside, she remained, her gaze holding his in the lamplight, spilling from the hotel windows. Samuel found himself at a crossroads, aware that his next words or actions would set a course difficult to alter later. The careful man he had been for 15 years counseled restraint, a polite farewell, and a return to the solitary existence he had deliberately crafted. But that man had begun to change from the moment Elizabeth Hargrove had descended from the stagecoach. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low but steady, "would you have dinner with me tomorrow evening? Not at Maggie's. I thought I might cook at my cabin." The invitation was significant, not only in its social implications, but because it meant opening his private sanctuary to another person for the first time in years. Elizabeth's expression softened with understanding. "I would like that very much, Samuel," she replied, her tone warm with more than just acceptance of a dinner invitation. For a moment longer, they stood in the gently falling snow, acknowledging without words the boundary they had just crossed. Then Elizabeth smiled once more and turned to enter the hotel, leaving Samuel to make his way back through the transformed landscape of Cottonwood Springs, a town that suddenly seemed filled with possibilities he had long denied existed. As Samuel walked back to his store through the softly falling snow, he reflected on the 15 years he had spent building a life defined by its predictability and isolation. He had come west seeking simplicity, constructing careful rules to protect himself from the complexities of deeper human connections. Now, in the space of a few short months, Elizabeth Hargrove had challenged those boundaries, revealing them as constraints rather than protections. The prospect of tomorrow's dinner filled him with both anticipation and trepidation, a reminder that to truly live meant accepting the risk of pain alongside the possibility of joy. The snow continued to fall, covering Cottonwood Springs in a blanket of white that seemed to promise new beginnings. Perhaps, Samuel thought as he reached his store, it was time to allow himself more than the careful half-life he had settled for after the war. Perhaps it was time to discover what might grow in the space created when carefully constructed walls began to fall away. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.